"So, what do you have here?" General Borodin asked the guard. "I found this thing sniffing around the perimeter wall," the guard said. He stood aside and pointed at the creature lying rigid in the mud. The animal was the size of a turkey, and covered in downy feathers that were matted with wet leaves and mud. The small, boxy head stared with glassy eyes. Its slack jaw hung open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The small, grasping two-fingered arm still trembled. Blood oozed from several bullet wounds along its dull green flank. The slender legs twitched slightly. The guard saluted Borodin. There was another one nearby, but it went and hid behind a tree. The guard said, "What is this thing?" General Borodin didn't speak. His eyes were huge and wet, his mouth agape. He turned to face Victor, and when he went to speak, a powerful roar rose from beyond the entrance of the compound. The ground shook throughout the clearing. Borodin spun on his heels and slapped the guard across the face hard. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Borodin screamed. "Quick, Victor, get rid of the prisoners. We need to get the collider ready, now." Somebody screamed from the entrance of the compound, and all of the men in the clearing turned to face the source of the sound. The towering steel doors of the gate were open, and in the darkness of the jungle beyond, a pair of ghastly eyes hovered 20 feet above the forest floor. In a flash of lightning, Borodin saw the legs of the second guard kicking from the clenched jaws of the mother Tyrannosaurus Rex. Her gargantuan brown body moved slowly, forcefully through the opened gates. Her dull brown feathers glistened red in the glow of the barrel fires that were scattered throughout the camp. All of the Russian soldiers began to scream, scrambling to get out of the way of the massive beast. Borodin looked back and forth, but his men were already cowering in fear. The mother was walking straight towards him, to the slain chick at his feet. He turned and ran. Victor turned to run as well, but Sergei pounced on top of him. The two men fought and rolled on the ground as the powerful footfalls came closer. The guard was gone, and the soldiers were screaming throughout the compound. The mother Tyrannosaurus thundered closer. Sergei strangled Victor until his eyes were bulging beneath the lens of his gas mask. Sergei looked over his shoulder and saw the mother crouching to sniff the body of her slain chick. The massive beast nudged the frail corpse of her child, trying to wake it up, and her chest started to heave with mounting panic. The mother Tyrannosaurus moaned loudly, shaking the air of the clearing. Some of the soldiers took shots at the massive predator from the cover of the other buildings, but most were sprinting toward the safety of the building that housed the collider. Victor was gasping for air and half screaming beneath Sergei. His fist struck Sergei in the chest, but Sergei was mentally absent from the fight. His eyes were on the mother. The mother Tyrannosaurus lifted her head and howled mournfully into the storm clouds, a sound so powerful that Sergei felt it move up his spinal column and into his skull until it was filled to the point of bursting. A second animal returned the horrendous cry from beyond the perimeter wall. The wailing beast sounded almost as large as the gargantuan mother. The perimeter wall was struck by a powerful force, and Sergei heard the cracking of cement splitting apart. The sound repeated again and again until the sound of crumbling concrete became incessant. The father Tyrannosaurus had finally found his family. Sergei locked eyes with the mother Tyrannosaurus. She lifted her huge head and craned her neck as she roared again, spit flying from her jaws. Her chest heaved with rage. The behemoth bellowed again and charged towards Sergei and Victor, lowering her neck to catch them in her jaws. Sergei leapt off Victor with a scream of terror and rolled across the muddy clearing. Victor scrambled to his feet, but the mother's taloned foot came down on him, crushing him with a wet, sickening pop. He didn't even have time to scream. Sergei scrambled away from the huge behemoth and charged to the back of the compound. His feet kept slipping in the mud. He ran through the barricade of trees that stood before the building that housed the collider. The sound of the shattering concrete finally reached a climax. The wall to the right of Sergei burst apart with a shower of fractured mortar, and the father Tyrannosaurus charged into the compound with a ferocious roar that made Sergei's knees buckle. The mother Tyrannosaurus quickly closed the distance to Sergei. She broke through the stand of trees and set the thin trunks rolling across the clearing. Sergei jumped over the bouncing logs and ran to the door of the collider's housing. Sergei turned and saw the mother and father snorting and huffing at each other. They rubbed their snouts against each other's manes, and a deep groan rose in the chest of the father. The mother released an ear-splitting cry, raising her head to the storm clouds. A powerful rumbling emitted from the father Tyrannosaurus as he nuzzled his mate. Sergei paused to watch briefly, stunned by the sight. The pair of leviathan predators stopped their vocalizations and turned to face Sergei. With a howling bellow, the behemoths charged. Sergei looked over his shoulder at the doorway to the collider, where Borodin and the others were screaming and shouting throughout the building. Sergei looked back to the charging Tyrannosaurs as he dove out of the way. The two Tyrannosaurs struck the building head-on, collapsing the front face of the concrete structure inward. The men inside of the room screamed and dove for cover. Others were crushed beneath the slabs of cement. The howling of the massive animals drowned the cries of the dead and dying. The Tyrannosaurs stopped just short of hitting the collider. They were physically halted by the pulsing blue light. The father Tyrannosaurus growled lowly, transfixed, but the mother broke her attention and started snapping at the dozens of still living humans darting around her feet. The father Tyrannosaurus turned his attention away as well and slammed his jaws shut over one of the Russians, splitting the screeching human in half. The remaining men stood no chance. Most were unarmed, and those that were could do little more than fire a few rounds at the massive predators before they were crushed underfoot or torn apart between the animals' powerful jaws. Borodin was on the floor, cowering from the human stampede. The mother bellowed over his head, and bones crunched in her jaws. Hot blood splashed over Borodin's body, and a pair of severed legs bounced off his back. He snapped out of his shock, retching in horror, and started dragging himself across the floor. The taloned foot of the mother slammed down on a crawling scientist beside Borodin. Borodin cried out and scrambled away around the collider to a door on the opposite wall. The father Tyrannosaurus roared from behind him, and the body of a soldier sailed over Borodin's head. Borodin saw the mangled corpse strike the wall beside his head, smearing a trail of blood down onto the floor. The screams of the other survivors were quickly cut short. Borodin was now alone. He waited and listened. The Tyrannosaurs were snorting heavily, crunching and swallowing their morsels. A few men moaned beneath their feet, and the collider hummed with its building energy. Borodin watched from around the corner of the collider as the two Tyrannosaurs each took a mouthful of humans and tromped outside. Borodin listened to the rain falling through the front of the building. Once Borodin was sure that the Leviathan carnivores were gone, he threw open the side door and sprinted outside. He ran along the perimeter wall towards his office. If he could get to a radio, he could call for help from Con Neen and the Viet Cong, or possibly an evac from the other Russian forces further north. He needed to escape. Borodin came to the massive hole where the father Tyrannosaurus had broken through the perimeter wall, and he stopped in his tracks. The two Tyrannosaurs were nuzzling their surviving chick in the center of the compound near the front gate. Borodin felt his knees go weak, and his bladder released. The shock hit him like a jolt of electricity. He was paralyzed, eyes wide and lips trembling at the brink of a scream. There was a soft hiss from the undergrowth beyond the gap in the perimeter wall. Borodin glanced in the direction of the sound, and he froze. Sergei was crouched amongst the ferns and palm fronds. He aimed an AK-47 at Borodin's face. Borodin shook his head roughly. No. Sergei nodded. He didn't show any emotion. The AK-47 screamed to life, and bullets struck the wall beside Borodin's head. With an ear-piercing clatter, Borodin dove forward and scrambled to his feet right into the line of sight of the two Tyrannosaurs. The chick, trotting beneath their feet, squealed in surprise, and the mother moved to protect it. Borodin stared. The father Tyrannosaur stood in front of his family and roared. Blood flurried from his yawning mouth. Borodin saw shredded flesh hanging from the behemoth's teeth. He couldn't will himself to move. The father Tyrannosaurus lowered its head, opened its jaws, and charged with an explosive scream. Borodin shrieked and sprinted towards Sergei. Sergei held his rifle and aimed it at Borodin, but he was watching the rapidly approaching father Tyrannosaurus. It was like watching an earthquake approach. The world shook and waved around the beast. Sergei saw Borodin's mouth stretched open in a scream, only a meter away, with the father Tyrannosaurus only a few feet behind him. Sergei rolled out of the way and Borodin trampled past. The heavy feet of the father Tyrannosaurus crashed through the foliage beside Sergei, tearing the vegetation out of the soil between his talons. Sergei watched as Borodin sprinted downhill, and the father Tyrannosaurus plowed through the forest after him. The mother Tyrannosaurus followed them out with the chick trotting like a dog beside her. The howling of the animals drifted further downhill until Sergei found he was listening to the echoes of chaos alone. The tree swayed in the wake of the pursuit. Sergei faintly heard Borodin's panicked screams, and he sighed. Sergei stood above the undergrowth and walked back into the compound. The clearing was silent, except for the rain and the pulsing of the collider. His mission wasn't over yet.